The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rabbi Paul Joseph, Associate Director of Humanities for Jewish Education here at the 92nd Street Y, and this is Jewish Omnibus, one of the last programs of this year. And I'm delighted to see so many hearty souls come out on such a gloomy night to share with us in the beginning of what we hope is going to be one of the most intellectually stimulating series that we've offered this year, Accounting for Jewish Survival. So often we hear people speak of 4,000 years of Jewish history, and the number trips off the tongue rather casually, especially as Passover approaches and we'll recount the history of our people once again. We sometimes forget in our modernity what a telescoping of experience that represents to say a number like that, and what a mystery it represents in the history of the world. Ephraim Speiser, in his introduction to his volume of the Anchor Bible, the book of Genesis, talks about the history of the Jewish people and how if the history of other peoples were described as a line inscribed on the arc of a circle, there would be lines of various length along that orbit. Only the history of the Jewish people can really be described as a sort of diameter of all of history. We were there at the dawn of recorded history in one sense or another, and thanks be to God, are still here today. The question is, what accounts for this mystery? And we begin our program with a historical understanding of it. We will move then to an attempt to interpret it through Marxian and universalist types of theories of accounting for the Jewish people's existence. And then we will move to an ethnological and sociological approach. And finally, we will answer with a contemporary theological understanding. That is to say, if all the natural explanations fall short, is there something that a person in his or her integrity can believe about the supernatural mystery of why the Jewish people are here? Although having had a chance to talk to our guest tonight, I suspect we'll begin to touch on that subject even this evening. Our guest this evening is Ellis Rivkin, who is Adolf S. Ochs Professor of Jewish History at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. He himself was educated as an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa, took his Master of Hebrew Literature degree from the Baltimore Hebrew College, and returned to Johns Hopkins for his PhD in history. He taught at Gratz College and at Dropsy College before coming to the Hebrew Union College in 1949. He's held visiting professorships at Antioch College, the University of Utah, Southern Methodist University, and the University of Cincinnati, as well as this semester being at the Spertus College of Jewish Studies in Chicago. He's the author of The Shaping of Jewish History, a radical new interpretation, a book I most heartily commend to you, and which was the inspiration for my inviting Dr. Rivkin here tonight. Also the author of A Hidden Revolution, The Pharisees' Search for the Kingdom Within, and most recently, What Crucified Jesus? The Political Execution of a Charismatic. His work, the one I've just shown you, The Shaping of Jewish History, was called by Judaism magazine unquestionably the most profound one-volume history of the Jews ever published. Won't you welcome Ellis Rivkin?
I'm certainly grateful for you that you selected that particular appreciation so that all of you are now alerted to how profound I am, and consequently you will...
Can you move into the mic a little bit?
Consequently, can you hear me now? Consequently, you will lend me your ears. First of all, it's a great honor to be here. And it's a great pleasure to have had this opportunity at long last to meet Rabbi Joseph and to spend a very, very intriguing dinner time with him. And of course, most of all, it's a great opportunity to try to share with you some of my own thinking with respect to the problem that you are dealing with in this series of lectures, which have to do with the Jewish survival and how that survival is to be accounted for. Now, it's simply a matter of fact that the Jewish people, and only the Jewish people, have had an experience, an historical experience that had its beginnings in the ancient Near East, maybe 3,000 or so years ago, as a small semi-nomadic grouping, and that has traversed over all of the stages and phases of the evolution and development of Western civilization to that point at time that we find ourselves now in, where this people is on the very frontiers, more precociously than any other grouping or any other people of the first post-industrial society in world history, and the first society whose major foundations are built on knowledge acquisition, knowledge processing, and knowledge dissemination. Now that in and of itself is an incredible experience, because there simply is no comparable experience. All other groupings, all other peoples, as Toynbee pointed out many, many years ago, have sooner or later, no matter how grand their civilization may have been, sooner or later came into confrontation with a challenge to which they could not adequately or creatively respond. The Jews are the only people who have met every single challenge along the way. And not only have they met every single challenge along the way, but they met each challenge, not by simple survival, but they've met each challenge in a creative kind of way. And each challenge in turn enriched the power of this people to play a creative role in the history, a special creative role in the history of all of humankind. As if this wasn't enough, it is important to bear in mind that this people was from its very beginnings, semi-nomadic beginnings, a tiny people. That through all of its first experiences, once they settled in the land, was one in which they enjoyed political sovereignty only for a few brief years. And they enjoyed this political sovereignty not because of any exercise of might or exercise of power, but by virtue of the loss of the exercise of that might and power on the part of the great empires, the great imperial powers of antiquity in the ancient Near East, such as Egypt and Assyria. It was only in the troughs between one imperial regnum and another that there was the possibility at all of playing at sovereignty, disporting at sovereignty, having the illusion that simply because the situation was such that no imperial power at that moment could exercise its might, that therefore a Saul or a David or a Solomon were really real potentates. It is true that when they did have this opportunity, they could play at being potentates. They could even play at struggling to gain advantage over other little powers, and even to find themselves at odds and constant conflict with each other when the United Monarchy came to an end and there was a splitting of the kingdom between North and South. So that the experience with political independence was very brief, and in the biblical period was a very poor showing. It didn't do so well. After all, in a little land such as the land of Israel happens to be able to split into two kingdoms is, I would say, quite an historic achievement. And as you read through the prophets and the historical books of the Bible, it is very, very evident that it was this period of sovereignty which was the most difficult and which most endangered the continuation of this people in terms of its special vocation, its special way of looking at itself as the selected people of God. And then the second spate of independence occurred during the Hasmonean, the brief period of Hasmonean rule, when by virtue, not of any intrinsic power, but by virtue of the breaking up of the Hellenistic monarchies on the one hand, and Rome's unreadiness yet to actually rule directly, it was possible to enjoy a very brief period of independence under the Hasmoneans, but very much like the split kingdom. Within a generation or so, there was a bitter civil war that split the people against the Hasmonean rulers who had gone over to the Sadducees, where the people at large were so loyal to the teachers of the halacha that they would have nothing of this of Alexander Aeneas, of the Hasmonean king of the time, and there was an eruption of a bitter civil war that could only be finally dealt with when the wife of Alexander Aeneas, Salome Alexandra, restored the halacha and the authority of the Pharisees and the authority of the sages. And then, very shortly thereafter, Rome began to move definitively and assertively, first through pawns like Herod, and then directly through procurators. And when the Jews, in desperation, rose up against the harshness of Roman rule and tried to gain independence, as you well know, the second temple was destroyed, razed to the ground. Many of the people were sent into exile, enslaved, and the Jerusalem for a very, very long time could not serve the role that it had previously played. Now, from that point on until the birth of the state of Israel, Jews lived primarily a diaspora experience. They never enjoyed independence again until the rise of the state of Israel, and even the rise of the state of Israel occurred at the time when a major imperial power, Great Britain, was disintegrating, and before the Pax Americana, America's effort to restructure the world, enabled once again Jews to take advantage of the situation and to have hopefully in this instance, a longer experience of some kind of political sovereignty. But I need not tell you how very fragile the situation is now as to what the outcome may ultimately be. So with these very few exceptions, two of which were abysmal failures, the period of the monarchy and the Hasmonean monarchy with the civil war that lasted almost through the entire reign of Alexander Aeneas. There is a history of powerlessness by any kind of normative measure. If we take political sovereignty as a norm and political power as the way to security, the Jews have been the most powerless of people and the most insecure from this point of view of all the peoples of the world, and yet this powerless people is the only people that made it. The most insecure of nations somehow or other had the knack for that which makes for ultimate security. That is the ultimate security of the continuity. not only of a people continuing through time, after all the Samaritans continued through time, but who continue to move through time in a continuously creative way, shaping and reshaping itself in the course of this remarkable kind of experience. Now, when we add to this, and we begin to look at what the sources of this security of the insecure might possibly be, we also have to take note of the fact that it was this people that generated out of its weakness at the very time where it seemed it was nip and tuck as to whether they would survive at all, at the time when the Assyrians came in and destroyed the kingdom of Israel, threatened the kingdom of Judah, that it was precisely at that point of the time when from any kind of measure of what is essential, the essential criteria for survival, they were able to deal with defeat, with devastating defeat, and find within this devastating defeat the source for that kind of incredible survival, which they were subsequently able to map out for themselves and forge for themselves. And that was in the prophecy, in the prophecies of the likes of Isaiah, and particularly Isaiah, where in the face of the facts, the face of empirical logic, the God of this people, the God of Israel, had been a dismal failure. The test of a God is to provide security. The test of the God is to give you a land. The test of a God is to sustain you in the land. And the ultimate test of a God is to be able to enable you to withstand an imperial conquest by virtue of that omnipotence that this God was presumed to have. And here this God was being defeated by the facts in the most obvious and the clear-cut kind of way. There is only one logic, and this God ought to give up any kind of claims to being a God at all, much less the only God that there is. At that particular moment in time, Isaiah viewed the process as evidence not of God's powerlessness, but of his incredible omnipotence. Because what is more powerful? How does a God most powerfully show himself? It is by taking other nations, by taking Assyria, turning it into the rod of God's anger to beat down his people because they hadn't fulfilled the covenant. Now, in the face of that interpretation, or as one might say, misinterpretation, in the face of refusing to let the facts speak clearly, to let empirical logic triumph, they simply use the facts themselves as evidence of the contrary. Here is the most powerful God, and now we know it, because he is the rod of God's anger. And fortunately, the quickness with which Assyria was overthrown by Babylonia, and the quickness with which Babylonia was subsequently to be overthrown by Persia, seemed to provide that factual evidence, that factual proof of Isaiah's claim, because Assyria was unable to sustain itself when facing Babylonia, and Babylonia was unable to sustain itself with all its power when faced by Persia, so that by the time the Persians allowed the Jews to return to the land, seemed as though the facts were now speaking out in confirmation of Isaiah's portrayal, his mode of interpretation, rather flying in the face of the facts. It now seems that this is what the facts must necessarily add up to. That is, this little people was witness to the dialectical processional of history, to a dialectical processional which has still not come to an end, in which imperial power moves on the scene, seems to be unconquerable, and is then collapses and is displaced by another imperial power. As Persia was displaced by Alexander, as Alexander was displaced by the Hellenistic monarchies and the splitting up of his empire. The Roman Empire subsequently displacing the Hellenistic monarchies in terms. The rise of Islam and the fall of Islam. The rise of Christendom and the fall of Christendom. The rise of nation states and the fall of nation states. All seem to be, as we now look back, all seem to have been previsioned in this interpretation given by Isaiah, these prophecies of Isaiah, which were simply based on faith that the God of this little people is the one God and an omnipotent God, and all other peoples, however imperialistically powerful they might be, can only have a limited stay, a limited time in the arena of history. So that we find this in terms of this uniqueness of this people, the fact that back then, at the moment of greatest impotence, there was an interpretation of the facts put together in such a way that it spelled out omnipotence, and then a whole array of historical facts through the rest of Jewish history seemed to confirm what Isaiah had intuitively sensed about not only the ultimate nature of this God as being omnipotent, but the ultimate nature of the historical processional of empire following empire. So not only then do we find this remarkable turning the facts on their refusing to bend to an empirical logic in the situation. Not only did this turn out to be the a key mode for survival, because nothing factual could ever be what it seemed to be for the Jewish people. If they were prosperous subsequent to this, then this was evidence of God's bounty. If they suffered, it was evidence of their sins. There was no evidence that could, in the factual realm, no experience in the experiential realm that could refute this kind of view of God. Whatever occurred, good or ill, was equally evident of the omnipotence of this God. And therefore, because they clung to the contrafactual, they clung to some kind of notion that the all-powerful was that God which gave them their peoplehood, that it turns out that this belief sustained them. And by virtue of the fact that this belief did not exist among other people, seemed to be the reason that they did not survive. So that we have to come up with a whole new concept of security. Insofar as the security of nationhood, of peoplehood is concerned, the normative is not the normal notion of power being the source of security, but the notion that being a people of God is an ultimate security, that the most insecure of nations, people have been, turned out to be, in a sense, the most secure, and the most secure of empires all turned out to have insecurity embedded in their very nature of their existence. Now, if then we add to this incredible kind of concept that they elicited from historical experience, and then we add to that the fact that not only were they able to secure their own continuity, but they gave birth to two world-girdling religions. This little nothing of a power gave birth to Christianity, which became world-girdling religion, and it was the belief system, the belief in this single God and this single God's omnipotence, however much facts seem to prove the contrary, was also that which generated out of itself Islam, which, like Christianity, was able to spread widely throughout the world. And insofar as what is preservative of Christianity and of Islam, though political power has always played a much more significant role than it has in the history of the Jewish people, what really preserves both Christianity and Islam at its very core is this ultimate belief that is the grounding of Israel, the continuation of Israel throughout the ages. Now, if we then add to this the fact that the diaspora experience of the Jews was no simple diaspora experience. It wasn't as though the Jews simply had to deal with the diaspora in Sasanian Persia, or deal with a diaspora in Islam, or deal with a diaspora in the Christian world, or to deal with the diasporas in the modern nation states. They lived in multiple diasporas at the same time, which were so radically different from one another, that the structures of the Jewish people erected for themselves and built for themselves, and the thrust of their peoplehood and their creativity was radically different one from the other, because there was this remarkable capacity not only to live in diasporas regionally, territorially separated from each other, and in diasporas, each of which represented a ruling civilization that was radically different, as the Muslim was from the Christian, but they had that keen capacity for absorption, of drawing in what was critical and vital and essential in each one of these separate and distinct diasporas and civilizations. One simply has to put side by side the Babylonian Talmud alongside the Palestinian Talmud, and you know immediately that the two Talmuds are different, not simply because there are different scholars that are seeing things in different ways. It's a different form. It's so different that the only explanation can be, well, one was an experience in the Sasanian world, the other's an experience in a collapsing, breaking down Roman world. Or when one considers the way in which the essential creativity of Islamic society was translated in the golden age of Spain into the most remarkable kind of poetry that we still remember and still read in the liturgy, and can still enjoy by virtue of its profundity and its sensitivity. Poetry which had simply faded out after the biblical period. There's no poetry that you will find after the Psalms down to the golden age of Spain in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century. Poetry has simply faded out. And now it burst out with all of its intense individuality, religiosity, with its uniqueness that can only come by virtue of a Jewish peoplehood, bursting out with a creativity that can only be accounted for by the bursting out of the muse, the poetic muse within Islam itself, in Spain itself. And remember, when Yehuda Halevi wrote his Ode to Zion, he did not write a psalm. It's not modeled on any of the psalms. It's modeled on the most advanced meter and rhyme and form and structure of the greatest Muslim poets of the time, so that you have the situation that the most compelling and the most deep feeling expression for Zion and the need to find one's way back to Zion has its power. Not by virtue of Psalms as the model, but by virtue of Islamic poetry as the model. Take and remove Islamic poetry, you don't have Yehuda Halevi's masterpiece. You don't have Ibn Gabirul, one of the most incredible liturgical pieces, which are the creation of Ibn Gabirul, read on the high holidays and so on. Where would that be? Didn't come from anything that was previously indigenous. So that when one follows on, turn to Rashi. And compare Rashi with Maimonides. You put Maimonides' guide, not just the Guide to the Perplexed, put his Mishnah Torah alongside Rashi's commentary, and you say, oh, well, this is the fruits of Islam. This is the fruits of Christian feudal Europe. That's how radically different they are one from the other. The Guide to the Perplexed, you don't have any kind of philosophy in Northern Europe at the time. And we also know the kind of struggles that occurred between Maimonides and anti-Maimonides in terms of which was, in other words, in a sense, it was a struggle between that form of Judaism, that way of looking at the world through this Jewish peoplehood, coming from living in a sophisticated society where philosophy, Aristotle, and so on had developed to the full, and the creation, the Jewish creation of Christian Europe, which was as clashing between Jews and Jews as it was between Christians and Muslims. So that if we move through all of Jewish history, we find indelibly imprinted, indelibly impressed on all of the most authoritative and inspirational creativity. We find that we have that imprimatur. We have the imprimatur of the ancient Near East in the Bible. Pick up the Bible, there's no way that you can escape the ancient Near East, not only because you're dealing with problems of the ancient Near East, but you're dealing with the forms, with the literature, with everything but the belief in a single God, being at one with an ancient Near Eastern experience. You go through the Mishnah. If you look at the Mishnah and you compare it with the 5 books of Moses and you compare it with the prophets and so on, you see that you're reading a Roman law book. Law in the 5 books of Moses, law in the Torah is never spelled out in this way. When we read the 5 books of Moses, we're reading law within the matrix in the context of history, historical narrative. There's no narrative in the Mishnah. There's no narrative in the Talmud, any of the Talmud. There's no narrative in the Gonic literature. It's all law, or agadic is separate, but the agadic is not the giving a history, or long stories like the story of Elijah and so on. They're little snippets, little like anecdotes, very entirely different. Where is that from? It certainly isn't the Bible, isn't the model. But take a look at Greco-Roman law books. And you'll see, my goodness, it can only be because of an experience with the Greco-Roman world. And I've already mentioned to you the impress of Islam. But this is also true with respect to this subsequent period with the modernization and westernization, and the way in which Jews had to struggle with these problems, like a Moses Mendelssohn, or in the case of ultra-Orthodoxy, of Samson Raphael Hirsch, and so on. All of this we find in our most inspirational text, our most authoritative text, our most impactful text. So that in order to undergo this Jewish experience, simply by moving through its creativity, you're simultaneously moving always through two worlds. The continuity of what the Jew is bringing to this new experience with another civilization, and that which that civilization is compelling the Jews to draw in as part of their new Jewish identity, if survival is to be possible. Now that is true of no other people. You read all of the major sources of the American experiences. It doesn't give you an experience with Christian medieval Europe. It doesn't give you an experience with Islam. You don't have in your fundamental law books of the land Aristotle, principles of Aristotle creeping out and showing through by virtue of actually wrestling with Aristotle. And the same way that throughout the ancient Near East, I mean, there's no compulsion to read any book of the Bible, to go back to the ancient Near East per se, to account for the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. And this is true for all the rest of the countries of Europe as well. Now that is utterly unique, which in other words, it means that if we're going to try to understand how survival was possible, it was possible by continuous process of absorption, not imitation. There's nothing imitative about the Mishnah. The Mishnah, as you well know, is as Jewish can be. The genius was to absorb and to imprint, or to absorb within that matrix of ongoing, continuous Jewish identity, that therefore gave it the hallmark of being Jewish. And it's very, very difficult to discover that the Mishnah really is incomprehensible unless you know something about Roman jurisprudence. It certainly wasn't the way it was looked at in the Middle of the Ages, or Eastern European yeshivas, or yeshivas today in New York and Israel and so forth. So this then is another incredible uniqueness that we factually have to take into account. And then there was this still a further uniqueness in terms of the diaspora experience. In dealing with the insecurity of the Jewish people, with the fact that we've undergone so many pogroms, and we've undergone so many sufferings, in so many ways have seemingly suffered because of our abnormalities of being this people, misplaced people, a disfigured people. We fail to take into account that the diaspora experience was an experience with the security and the insecurity of the peoples among whom we lived. There wasn't a single society that Jews lived in that did not extend to the Jews not only the right of settlement, not only the right of living in a land that was not where they had no power to live. It was simply on the sufferance of those who allowed them to settle there. But frequently they were privileged. When Jews first came to Alexandria, they had no power, no right to come to Alexandria. Back in ancient Alexandria, they weren't Greeks. How was it then that it was not only a Hellenistic king, a Ptolemy, but a king who believed that he was God, or at least wanted everybody to confirm or that they should believe at least that he was God, making a special exemption for these Jews who had no armies, who had no way of forcing anything on these on a Ptolemy emperor, and showered them with a privilege that was only given to the Greeks, that they could have their own autonomous community with all the rights of the Greeks, and they were separated out from the Egyptians who had no such rights at all, with the additional right of not believing in the emperor as God, and because of this having their own separate polis, their own separate politeia, their own separate autonomy alongside this other autonomy on the basis of co-equality. Now, after all, where was the power for this coming from? This was something that was bestowed upon them, a powerless people. And all that was required of them was to acknowledge not the divinity of the emperor, but the sovereignty of the emperor. And that they did by building prayer houses where they offered up prayers to God, the one God, for the preservation of the health, well-being, prosperity of the emperor. Now, it is true that a time came in the first century where this Jewish community collapsed, where it was subject to pogroms, where the Jews who lived in the finest areas of Alexandria were herded off and forced to live in the equivalent of a kind of a ghetto. But this was when the larger society, the Alexandrian society of which they were part, was also collapsing. It was when the Hellenistic, when the Ptolemies were secure, Jews enjoyed security. When they became insecure, the Jews were the first to feel the first pangs of the insecurity that ultimately was to denude Alexandria of that incredible greatness that it had. I mean, Alexandria in antiquity was just a marvel, and it was gone. Never really to recuperate, ever again. The Jews were part of that process. It wasn't as though Alexandria got scot-free, and the Jews were the only ones that had to suffer. So they participate. The Jews have participated in the security of nations when they're on the make. They are the first to experience the insecurity of nations when these nations are feeling the first signs of disintegration and collapse. Because the same thing happened again and again. I won't deal with all of the instances. About the Sasanian world, in the beginning, Jews were privileged, even though they were not Sasanian. Sasanian society begins to collapse, Jews suffer. In Islam is one of the best examples. First in Eastern Islam, the Jews were so privileged in Eastern Islam that they could have a goanate, they could engage in trade, commerce, and so on, had very, very great prosperity, and it was a very, very flourishing epoch until the 10th century. But in the very 10th century, when the Abbasid Empire was collapsing, and the Jews were feeling the consequences of this collapse, Jews living in Western Islam and Islamic Spain were on the ascendancy. Here in an Islamic land, under the same aegis, Islamic aegis, a Jew could become the equivalent of a Secretary of State in the Minister of Foreign Affairs, like Chazdai ibn Shaprut, could become a vizier, the power behind the throne, as in the case of Samuel Hanagi, even though this was absolutely forbidden by the Quran. So here you have Jews living in insecure Islam, suffering. Jews living in secure Islam in Spain, enjoying all the fruits of the security of the host people. Only in Spain again in the 13th century, all of this collapsed with the collapse of of the glory of Muslim civilization in that part of the world. Even in Christianity, Jews in feudal Europe in the early years were welcome. They were brought specially there to help found cities. Charters were given to them, protecting their rights. And for several centuries, they certainly were in a much more privileged position than the serfs. And they even had the right to ride horses. They even had a right to bear arms in those early days. It was only with the breakdown and the collapse of the larger society, the insecurities inherent in the nature of nations who see their security lying in power, that they began to be pogromed. But when Jews were pogromed in Northern Europe, they went to Spain, where they were welcomed. The same crusaders that were denouncing them for killing Christ in the north found that they were absolutely vital and necessary when they moved, when these same princes moved, taking over the Islamic lands in the south. Perhaps some of you saw just the other day that Poland is offering to provide Jews going to Israel with passage through Poland when Hungary, for whatever the reason, is no longer allowing it. And they referred to the fact that Poland had been this great haven of Jewish refuge back in the 15th century. That's right. Jews were fleeing collapsing Germany, the insecurity of Germany, and moving to the security of Poland, which at that time was a very thriving state by comparison, showered with the same kind of charters that were being taken away from them. So here you have three parts of Christianity. You have northern Christian Europe pogroming the Jews, the Christian Europe that's building up in Spain, welcoming these very same Jews. The Jews are suffering from the insecurities of the collapse of the German Empire in Central Europe, and they go to Poland, where Poland is only too happy to have them. And then what happens in Poland just a few centuries subsequently? And what about the modern period? After all, who compelled the Dutch to allow the Jews to settle? What power did the Jews exercise that they could settle in Holland? And in terms of international trade, to be treated as equals. And when you got your really first true modern Western society. Or perhaps it was the great power that the Jews possessed in the colonies that accounted for the non-inclusion of the Jews, either exclusion or inclusion of the Jews in any of the founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution. Collapsing Germany, the insecurity of Germany, and moving to the security of Poland, which at that time was a very thriving state by comparison, showered with the same kind of charters that were being taken away from them. So here you have three parts of Christianity. You have northern Christian Europe pogroming the Jews, the Christian Europe that's building up in Spain, welcoming these very same Jews. The Jews are suffering from the insecurities of the collapse of the German Empire in Central Europe, and they go to Poland, where Poland is only too happy to have them. And then what happens in Poland just a few centuries subsequently? And what about the modern period? After all, who compelled the Dutch to allow the Jews to settle? What power did the Jews exercise that they could settle in Holland? And in terms of international trade, to be treated as equals. And when you got your really first true modern Western society. Or perhaps it was the great power that the Jews possessed in the colonies that accounted for the non-inclusion of the Jews, either exclusion or inclusion of the Jews in any of the founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution. Jews, unlike slaves, were included as all men being created equal, simply by not being mentioned. So where did that power come from? But we see this was in the United States, which became one of the most secure entities that in the whole history of humankind. The fact that the United States, from its very beginnings, was cradled, so to speak, in security, enabled them to offer Jews that security which they could not gain for themselves by virtue of what is viewed as the normative. Not once did Jews ever gain any kind of access to a diaspora country by virtue of power in any of these senses. And yet every single country welcomed them at one time or another. And it was only when they fell apart that Jews naturally would feel the suffering first, because that's true, they didn't have any way to defend themselves. But who had a way of defending themselves? Did the feudal nobles defend themselves successfully with all of their power against the kings, with the rise of absolutism? And when you get the great mighty nations of the modern world, weren't they slugging it out with each other from the 8th to 17th century on? And then World War I, we're not talking about, it goes without saying when you're dealing with Hitler, but look at World War I and the Battle of Verdun. Where was France's security at Verdun? Where was German security at Verdun? They just slaughtered each other. Because of the issues that once you're dealing with the problem of state power, you are dealing with other state powers. And once you're dealing with other state powers, it's hit or miss. It's always a gamble, whether you will or will not. Let's face it. What did all of German power, Hitler's power, did it spare him the defeat? Devastating defeat? Was Japan spared a devastating defeat because they had kamikaze pilots and so on? Whereas Jews didn't have these things? Of course they didn't have a Holocaust. And look, the Holocaust is a very, very, it's a tremendum. It's on a very, very different kind of level. But we're not talking about a Holocaust occurring and no other peoples that had seemingly all of that's needed for security having a good time of it. The Germans, there was nothing to be relished, freezing to death as a German, as a Nazi, in the steppes of Russia in the cold winters, or being blown up in Hamburg, or the terror, those bombings, terror bombings there. And what about Nagasaki and Hiroshima? Where did all of Japan's security come from? They had their own kind of Holocaust, which were not on the same order. Because we, in a sense, we had, in a sense, no way else but to try to defend ourselves. So here then is the remarkable record of a people that not only absorbed within the very nature of their identities, absorbed every single critical element in the evolution and the development of Western civilization, from its beginnings in the ancient Near East until our very own day. And this is a people who, with all of their powerlessness, constantly find themselves welcome among other peoples, and remain welcome until these normative peoples are faced with the plague of the insecurities. So perhaps we should think in some way or other, however strange and paradoxical it may seem, the security of the Jews, or the security of the Jewish people, and the insecurity of the nations. Now, to cap it all, how is it that here in the United States, this powerless people by any kind of normal standards, how is it that we, as an entity, are on the, more so than any other grouping or entity, on the very frontiers of knowledge building? There is no other people in the world with so much concentrated mental capital as this little people, particularly in the United States and Great Britain, and to some extent in Israel that as well. And mental capital is the capital of the new age. 90% probably of all Jews of college age go to college. No other people in the world has that kind of, anywhere near that kind of percentage. United States, if 50% go, That's still incredibly high. In Japan, in Germany, England, and so on, 15%, 20%. Here, 90%. And they began as semi-nomads. And end up, just take a look, just go through the roll call of mental accomplishment, not to speak of spiritual and artistic and every other kind of thing. And yet we find that they're still acknowledging themselves as being Jewish, as part of this remarkable people, this powerless people. That is where, in a sense, the whole future of humankind is dependent on the proper, appropriate use of mental capital. I'm sure that Gorbachev, if he had his way and didn't have to deal with all of the tremendous problems he had to deal with, would seek out to hold on to every single Jew that he could hold on to and import Jews, as was the case in the past. Because that's basically what he needs. One of the things that's lacking for this perestroika is that he's not able to use that talent. Not because he wouldn't want to, but because of the nature of the political situation and so forth. So there is your record for you. Now, the question now is, how did they do this? How was anything so remarkable accomplished? It was accomplished, one, because it began with an idea. It didn't begin with power, it began with an idea. And that idea was that there was one power underlying all of reality in all of its varieties and not multiple powers. Already in the semi-nomadic age, you had one patriarch and one God. And back then with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you already had not only one God, but you had this God viewed as having all the power necessary to preserve this people if this people continued to believe that there was only one God or one power underlying all of reality. The result was that by the resilience and the flexibility that lodges within unity, as against the lack of such flexibility that lodges in a diversity principle, which is polytheism, a unity principle. A belief that one power underlies all power allows for continuous expansion of what that unity undergirds. It's like an individual. An individual is singular. But as an individual evolves and develops, the one becomes more and more full of the many. More and more is drawn from without and absorbed from within. But if an individual was multiplicity, if every stage of our evolution of development had nothing to do with the previous stage, if we were completely, each part of us was separate and discrete, then there's no way of accounting for dealing with a process of becoming more than you were, precisely because you are, in some sense, always the same as you were from the very beginning. So this unity was critical, this belief. So that when they had new experiences, like in the wilderness, but particularly when they came into the land, and they settled in the land, and ceased to be, for the most part, semi-nomads, and they became an agricultural and urban people. And they needed more sophisticated institutions. The prophets simply assumed that God could handle this. Here was all this omnipotence. Well, you only needed a little bit of the omnipotence in a semi-nomadic society. You needed more in a agricultural, urban society. You need more when you get to a Greco-Roman world. You need more when you get to Islam. You need more when you get to Christianity and so on. So all you do is just draw an unused omnipotence. Don't you see? Novelty of experience. Take it with yourself. You have new experiences. So do you fall apart? Some do, but do you fall apart, or do you become more than you were? Are you less than you were when after you go through you go through college and university, and even when you become a professor, you might not be less than you were before. So this is it. So there's no other. It was there. No other people had that idea in the very beginning. But see, you could start out with a simple idea, almost naive. But you see, it can expand. It can expand to that point that when Einstein comes along, E equals mc squared is nothing other than, here's some more unused omnipotence that we can, or DNA or whatever. Anything that brings together all this complexity under singularity is all simply grist to this unity principle that accounts for this continuation. Now, it was the unity principle, and because of the commitment to that unity, when new problems arose, when problems remained the same, you replicated. When new problems emerged, you variated. Like Amos comes along and says he's neither a prophet nor a son of a prophet, but he is a prophet, obviously. He's got to deal with new problems. Don't you see? Isaiah is that perfect example that I gave you. Here is Isaiah, who is not like the older prophets like Elijah and so on, dealing with these complex kind of problems and so forth, and finding that God is Assyria is the God of wrath, anger. Don't you see? This is simply a variation of prophecy. Don't you see? The problem-solving capacity inheres in a unity principle, which allows for replication when there are no new problems, variation when the problems are somewhat more difficult. And 4 times in our history at least, 3 or 4 times in our history at least, there are mutations. These mutations are when life and death problems face the people. There's no precedent. A point came where the prophets simply couldn't handle the next set of problems that came along. And when that occurred, you had a mutation, and prophecy came to an end. Instead, you had a book, the 5 books of Moses. Instead, you had a priesthood. Entirely, the radical disjunction between the prophetic form of Judaism and the post-prophetic form of Judaism is a marvel to behold, and yet it's the same people that's undergoing it. And then the mutation that led to the birth of the halacha, the belief in one God, 2 laws, eternal life and resurrection. That hadn't been heard of before. It was needed because of problems that emerged at the time of the Antiochian decrees. All through the Middle Ages and so on, when Jews lived in every conceivable kind of diaspora, side by side, you had all of the variations of halachic Judaism. When they came up to when they dealt with the problem of modernization, westernization, intellectual revolution, you got another mutation in Reform Judaism. When you had to deal with the problem of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, at the time of nationalism and so on, you got the birth of Jewish nationalism, secularism, which is another mutation. Now, that capacity for perpetual problem solving, by virtue of that initial belief that there is one power underlying all of reality, that is the dynamics which made all of this possible. Replication, variation, and if necessary, mutation. And once you have mutation, which allows for absolute novelty, what problem can't you solve? It's the only people. And that's why, unlike those other civilizations of Toynbee, who tossed us into a state of congealment back in the Hasmonean period, we were the most powerless of people, had what is needed for survival: an idea, and the flexibility of problem solving, even replication, variant, and if necessary, sheer breakthrough into novelty, which ultimately leads to this kind of plurality, the pluralism, the Jewish people, of the pluralistic Jewish people of our own day, and those of you who have gathered here. Now, one final note of the significance of this survivalism, this creative survivalism, and I'll bring my lecture to an end. Remember that impossibility way back then in the time of Assyria, when Isaiah said that now we know how omnipotent God is, because he uses Assyria as a rod for his anger to punish and beat up his people. At that very time, when the very physical existence of this people was in danger, not only did he come through with this, but he came through with a vision that a time would come. That a time would come when nations would beat swords and would beat swords into plowshare, and there wouldn't be war anymore. What could have been a greater impossibility, strictly speaking, than nations not warring with each other? And in a magnificent passage, he said a day would come when Assyria and Egypt both would be equivalent in God's sight as God's heritage, the people of Israel. Impossibility of impossibilities. And yet that whole array of possibilities of a messianic age, when all objective anxiety would come to an end, was what Jews were most secure about during their efforts to, as they made their way through their literally cosmic experience with the nations and the peoples of the world. Don't you see? Ultimately, this God is a God not only of this chosen people, but he's a God of those who are trying to erase this people, who at some time would come when it would be no secret anymore that they're equally the creation of this God. So they clung to this impossibility as though it were true, and all the other nations clung to the factual evidence and empiric logic. Came up with, in the Greek world, with the myth of Sisyphus. It will garnish health, and nothing you will do will ever. Take the great Thucydides, all the great historians. They thought wars there was no way out. And certainly human endeavor, human aspiration, that's what Greek tragedy is all about. When you're right on the edge, like Sisyphus, at the very top, that's when you're going to start. And the people of Israel, Jewish people, seem to have been the best evidence of the myth of Sisyphus. You know, we went up with this nation, that nation, and so on, and we came down with them. Yet that one set of these impossibilities right before our very eyes is occurring. The European community has emerged where literally those nations which always lifted up sword against nation, France and Germany, England, and all these countries, are now in a community that can never lift up sword against each other ever again, and they're in the process of bringing all of this Eastern Europe, which is collapsing, into this expanding community, a commonwealth of sovereign nation without real sovereignty. And for the first time, nations can enjoy security. So it turns out, and Israel, by the way, will be one of the beneficiaries of this, I would think. So it turns out that we have turned out that vision of Isaiah simply required time. It required experience. It required understanding, but by God, it's right on hand. And if that age should ever come, and one was to say, look back and say, well, what was critical? Was it critical that the Roman Empire be a Roman Empire? Was it critical that the Pax Britannica and so on? Was that what was critical? What was critical is what is it that's unique about this new world? Everything unique about this new world was foreseen by Isaiah, was clung to by this people, was transmitted to Christianity and Islam with their own particular version of this kind of thing, and that which seemed to be the impossible turns out to have been the goal. And this new world that may be aborning simply could not be that world that it might become if this helpless little people hadn't found a kind of ultimate security for peoplehood that now, for the first time, all the nations of the world are beginning to glimpse, because what we had was something to be a people for. And we weren't a people for imperialism. We weren't a people for violence. In a sense, we never were allowed to be that kind of people. This then was our destiny. This, it seems to me, is the way in which we can view our select role as first. Remember, Abraham was chosen to be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. Whether we wanted it or not, so indeed have we been, and so indeed are we now, and so indeed ultimately will all the peoples of the world recognize how critical for their peoplehood was our survival. Thank you.
I'll let you take a drink of water, or a few. I am going to open it up for questions to you folks, because I'm sure that there are things that you would want to follow up on. But my privilege in being here is being able to ask the first questions, and maybe they will cover some of your questions as well. If I can just sort of recap a couple of things and let you get your breath. Did people believe Isaiah in the day that he spoke? Why would anybody believe him at all? It was so non-empirical, it was so pie in the sky, ahistorical. Obviously then somebody must have preserved this statement of his till the time when there was enough evidence in to prove the naysayers were wrong and that Isaiah had seen it appropriately. Is that the way it happens? I mean, is it in some ways just a matter of enduring until the validation shows up?
Well, I think
you have to come in a little closer now if we're going to get this on tape and everybody's going to hear you.
I think in this instance we have to remember that Isaiah was dealing with a people that already had been constituted for a long time. The critical for this people was the fact that they had successfully conquered the land and settled in the land, and they assumed that God had given. It was God's power that had given to them. So they were starting out with the assumption of omnipotence. Now, of course, at the same time, you had the problem of polytheism, which were claiming that there are multiple gods, that you just can't have one God that is capable of all the functions. And this, again, was trying to indicate that, well, one God is obviously not able to protect you in this instance. But mainly they were coming with that belief, one, that is those who would listen to Isaiah. They came to, one, that there was one God. Two, this God already demonstrated power. One, with the patriarchs as sojourners. Two, with Moses and wilderness and taken out of Egypt and so forth. Three, with the conquest of the land.
Right.
And four, with the, the continuation of what there was to this day. So that when they heard this, even if at the time they may have discounted this, we simply know that possibly because of the quickness. See, if Babylonia hadn't so quickly, in a sense, confirmed Isaiah,
right.
That obviously if Babylonia could defeat Assyria, then yes, Assyria's power is as fleeting, so to speak, as
right.
Their own. Then Babylonia, and then very quickly Persia.
Right.
So you had three, that's what I try to say. You started out with a contrafactual, but then you had three facts coming
right.
quickly
right.
to say, oh, well, yes, of course he was right. Yes, this is, it isn't because Assyria's powerful. Assyria's God was powerful. Why is Babylonia defeating it?
Right.
And then, of course, when they reconstituted themselves under the Persians, were given this autonomy as a people there, they began with this. Then you had no polytheism anymore. You simply had to believe in this one God, and therefore this God could certainly do anything that this God wanted to. And you had the first chapter of Genesis, and so I think it was there was enough that believed that this God was real.
Right.
The point is, whether this God is or is not real, acting out on the reality of this God as against acting out on any other preconception proved to be of the highest survival value.
Right.
In other words, so it doesn't in a sense make any difference. We don't need, simply because I say I believe that there may be this kind of God, but another Jew will come along and say I can't buy any of that kind of stuff. But then I said, well then, if you're going to account for survival, it was the belief in one God that did it, even though there may not have been one God to believe in.
Mm-hmm. I really was overwhelmed with your description and this whole idea of the way in which we absorb what we encounter, and at the same time there's the new creature that emerges, identifies itself with its own past and thereby appropriates it, and so indeed it is its whole past, and so on. Would we dare, do you dare to be predictive? As I heard you describing this vast panoply of history, I couldn't help but think to myself, where should the Jews move next? Do we go to Japan now? All right? Do we have a settlement in Tokyo before the next wave of history as it's emerging? Care to say anything about that?
Surely, I would say that what is now emerging is we see in process. Obviously, there's no guarantee yet, but the sort of thing that's happening in Eastern Europe and so on is a good example. I would say that what is now opening up is the freedom of Jews and anyone else to be able to find a home anywhere they would like to have a home without any kind of derogation, so to speak, of the nationality into which they were born. So that you're really getting a global community emerging where, particularly now we see with Europe, where being a European is a far more secure identity than just being a French person. Mm-hmm. But the great thing about it is that you're not taking Frenchhood away. You're simply saying, it's like with Jews, you're not taking Frenchhood away when you give them real security rather than insecurity. France only had insecurity. Louis XIV had security, so Louis XV began to lose it, right? Charles V. Look, the psalmist was right, princes are, in God's sight, princes are here today and basically gone tomorrow kind of thing. So what we're trying to get at was that whereas Jewish people experienced an intrinsically secure peoplehood, which could never be taken away from them whether they lost battles or didn't lose battles and so forth. Other peoples have seen their security dependent on the power to wage war, to protect it, and so on. And as a consequence, continually we're sacrificing what is uniquely French, what is uniquely German, what is uniquely any of these. For example, the United States, look how the United States is an initial spirit of liberation, again and again had to be violated, to annex Mexico, parts of Mexico, to fight to take over the Philippines, to engage in imperialist wars, or take Britain, etc. So in a sense, what is ultimate to the true people of the United States was continually being lost out of a false sense of what where security really comes from. The Japanese, look how the Japanese, they're a miracle, they're an economic miracle. Well, that's something to be pretty proud of, to make the best cars in the world. Not particularly, what's so great about being a kamikaze, and trying to blow up an American warship? And the same way with Germany, it's an economic miracle. These two are powerless countries. So I'm trying to say that the ultimate of peoplehood has been experienced by us. Mm-hmm. But the point is, we always think that somehow or other, we were the ones that were beset by insecurity as though the rest of the world is secure. Right. Just take a look at the history of the insecurity of nations. Do you think it was fun collapsing in the Roman Empire? Right. or to be an emperor when 23
especially in the year 69 or 70, right. Well, but now let me ask then: is there a there's a cultural lag here going on because all the world hasn't reached the threshold of globalism, and it's our bad luck, you might say, in a sense that our new state of Israel is located right in the midst of all the nation-state craziness of 100 years ago in Europe. Does that bode well for us, or ill, or?
Okay. To throw out a real major gleam of hope with respect to Israel, I would say something like this: thank God, in the last few years, the world agenda has totally changed, where sovereignty and nationalism cease to be the focal concern. In other words, when Europe took in Portugal, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, East Germany being absorbed into West Germany, the Baltic states on the way to some kind of, maybe not independent, but certainly a tremendous amount of the equivalent of a Commonwealth kind of status. And then with all that's happening in terms of the future of Eastern Europe, then what we're going to see is that if countries like Britain and France and Germany and so on no longer see the essence of their peoplehood in expressing having full and complete total sovereignty, why should Israel think that she only has to have this? So the way to security for Israel, it will be, as I think is happening, by the European model. I think Eban said that just the other day in an article in the London Times. So what you have is, why not think of instead of thinking of a Palestinian state that's got to take Israel in order for a Palestinian to feel a true Palestinian, or Israel to have the West Bank to prove that they are able to preserve their security. Why not take a look at countries like Luxembourg? Take a look at a country like Liechtenstein. Take a look at a country like Monaco. Now, Luxembourg has a total of 650 troops, and is the richest per capita nation in the world. Now, do you think any Luxembourgian is going around and saying, but I don't have atomic bombs? I'm really not a super duper power. I'm a nothing, as he sits securely with his bank accounts and so on, paying no taxes and so on. So he's insecure. All right, so I think, therefore, with Arafat's turnaround, I think that was part of this larger process that's taking place. Sure, you had no right to trust him because you were still dealing with the old agenda. The old agenda has been erased by this move to Europe. By 1992, all barriers in Europe are going to be gone. Right. You see? So there are no new ways to come about it. So a Palestinian state that at one time might be threatening, if it's going to be like Monaco or Luxembourg with 50 soldiers, is hardly scary. Now, once that happens, then look, there's no reason. Palestinians, Arabs have lived in Israel and have prospered in Israel. And there's no reason why Israelis can't live in a Palestinian territory. I mean, it's meaningless. It'll just become so you have the trappings of sovereignty, so you don't feel subjugated. I think that the European I think that Britain and Europe are absolutely committed to Israel, and I think they, judging from, I don't know whether you're aware, but about 1985, Perez at that time was in London, and he met with Mrs. Thatcher, and at that time the Defense Secretary, Sir Irving Howe. And he came out with a call for a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. I don't know whether any of you remember, it didn't get much play in the American press, but this was after discussions. It was, in a sense, the British-European plan. And it's to be funded, not by the United States, but by Europe and Japan. Now that means, also the European community has confirmed treaties giving Israel equal access to the European community markets. But a condition for that was passed only after Israel allowed grapefruit to go from the West Bank to Europe, marked produce of the West Bank. On that same day, it was confirmed. That's in a sense, Israel has already recognized the Palestinian entity de facto. It's just now a political issue of how you're going to deal with it. So that Europe is certainly very positively oriented towards a flourishing Israel. And they have a lot more clout with the Arabs and the Palestinians and so on than the United States has ever been able to get. Now, if that happens, Israel will become, let's say, the equivalent of the Hong Kong of the whole Middle East.
Right. Now that there's no Lebanon left.
Exactly. But the point is, Hong Kong has lived next to China.
Right.
And nobody ever touched Hong Kong. Right.
Right.
And now whatever's happening there is all by agreement or whatever the case may be. Or take a look at Austria, flourishing, and it's, it was once in a sense, these are internationally recognized communities whose security comes from their need, the service. Switzerland.
Right.
How Switzerland was a serving nation rather than a powerful nation. Now, Israel, that's it. Israel, when we were invited to all these different countries because we have something to offer. I'm talking about all this mental capital. You know, all of Thatcher's closest aides have been Jews. Mm-hmm. She refused to go to Bitburg when Reagan did go to Bitburg. She talked about her role that she played when she met in last September with Gorbachev to get Gorbachev to let the Jews go. And she said to the Jewish deputies in England that if it were up to Gorbachev, he'd want to keep the Jews, but it's too dangerous for them. This anti-Semitism is something that he just simply can't wipe out. He's got so many other troubles at the same time. Now just imagine for a moment, with Israel's agriculture flourishing, its high-tech flourishing, having access through Europe to Africa, Asia, and so on, etc. And then, in addition to all of this, become a banking center. You see, with the collapse of Beirut, there is no banking center between London and Bahrain. Mm-hmm. Now just imagine what Israel is going to be like. And then, you see, she'll be like Hong Kong. Everybody will need her services, and then she'll have real people. So in a sense, she becomes a diaspora of people in the land. And the great achievement of the state of Israel was to make certain, in a sense, that there would be a major Jewish presence in the Middle East, which wouldn't have been there if the state of Israel hadn't emerged. At that time, there wasn't anything else on the agenda but statehood, but I think the agenda is changing, and I'm happy for that.
Okay, I'm going to open it up and invite folks to ask questions. In the second row, the blue shirt. Could you stand up so most people can hear, and then I'll try to summarize the question if it's not heard.
By the way, if I don't seem to see you, it's because because the lights are glaring.
The question was relating Emil Fackenheim's notion to the fact that the Holocaust, the Shoah, confronted us with something which was unassimilable and really played havoc with our theological apparatuses of yesteryear. And at this point, the only way the Jewish people can reconstitute itself is through an active will of co-relation among and within the people, rather than maintaining this earlier belief that the one God was somehow in charge.
Well, I think one of the first differences I imagine that Fackenheim and I would have is that what do we mean when we talk about God? Now, as an historian, and this was part of the whole process, I've seen the concept of God continuously undergo radical change, particularly when you had mutations. So that you're not talking now about, I am not talking about God in the sense that God delivers in the way he was pictured as delivering in the biblical period, or the way he was pictured as offering eternal life and salvation eternal life and resurrection with the birth of the halacha, so that if you didn't get your reward in this world, you would get it in some future world. I've seen the idea of God undergo tremendous reformulation all along the line in Maimonides and the Zohar and so on. So many of these reformulations at the time were rejected by many Jews as not really being God at all. But obviously, we still study Maimonides and study the Zohar maybe more than we've ever studied in a very, very long time. I'm dealing with something different. I'm talking about what was it that the Jews believed, whether it was true or not, that enabled them to reach this day the way they had. So that it was the fact that they believed there was a God that was showing his power when they were being beaten up, that gave them the resilience not to give up. Now that's independent of whether such a God does or does not exist. So that when you're talking about a Holocaust, the way I would look at it, I would say, well, the Holocaust, first place, I don't consider the Holocaust as unexplainable. I've studied enough about history to see that the capacity for evil is only limited by the technology to perpetrate it. In other words, you've got a Holocaust because Holocaust was, on this scale, was possible with new technologies. The wish for Holocaust for the Jewish people were certainly expressed. The people that the pogrom, when Jews were beset by pogrom, don't you think the people would have liked to have wiped out the Jews completely? Just weren't able to do it. So I don't want to make it unique. To make it unique renders it beyond hope of ever finding a way out, because it was just going to come. Hitler had the opportunity. Look at Stalin. Look how evil Stalin was. And he did it against his own people. Though he threw in some anti-Semitism, but he did in a way to his own, wiped out the peasantry, starved them, put them in concentration camps. I don't have to tell you all these things. So suppose Stalin were Hitler and Hitler were Stalin. You know, it was really two faces of the same coin, except that the Jews in Germany were utilizable by Hitler in a way that they weren't utilizable in a Soviet-type state that emerged. So when I would deal with the Holocaust, I don't say, well, God does or doesn't intervene. All I'm saying is there some way of understanding how this kind of evil could reach such ripeness that it seemed to mutate? It became pure evil rather than on the edges of evil, the normal evil that you and I are accustomed to. Then where I see it coming from, yes, I see an explanation. It comes from the insecurity of nations. It was Germany's insecurity with respect to her growing economic power that led her to take the risk of World War I. Because there was no way within that nation-state system that didn't allow for a European community, we have it today, for Germany's wealth to be part of a common pool of expanding wealth for a whole continent. That's what they're doing now. French wealth and the capacity for wealth making is now pooled. Everybody is going to benefit from it, but it wasn't available. And here there was no issue of totalitarianism and no issue of anti-Semitism and so forth. At Verdun, how do you explain the slaughter at Verdun? That's the insecurity of nations. Then at the end of World War II, you got the Treaty of Versailles, which guaranteed the insecurity of Germany. It made it certain that Germany could not possibly, we're going to do everything possible to get out of the insecurity that she was in. So you get your Hitler. And because of that, of the time when he was coming to power, where it was that he was going to, the security for Germany required the rooting out of anything that might endanger insecurity, so he could point to the Jews and said, this is where your insecurity really comes from, because they were the ones that were behind the British, they were the ones behind the French, they were behind World War I, they were behind the Versailles, etc. So therefore, you can't destroy them on battlefields. You can't blow them up. So you destroy them in the only way you know how. It's an anomalous people, so you put them in concentration camps. That's why a Holocaust, Nagasaki and Hiroshima doesn't look quite the same as this Holocaust, because it was done in the normal way of solving nations' insecurities, by blowing the other nation up. Then it's okay. Women, children, and so forth. But here, of course, I see it as the total evil of the unresolved problem of the insecurity of nations all became focused in on the Holocaust. But its true meaning was lost at that time, because it couldn't be, nobody understood it, and it couldn't be, the conclusion couldn't be drawn from it. And the Jews who were most in the position to draw it, their very lives were in, if they didn't have Israel, they would have nothing. So therefore they began to think, as Fackenheim did, this will now mean that we'll have our own fate in our own hand. But if the United States hadn't supported Israel, if both superpowers, if the superpowers all ganged up against Israel, could Israel survive? Quite the same as this Holocaust, because it was done in the normal way of solving nations' insecurities, by blowing the other nation up. Then it's okay. Women, children, and so forth. But here, of course, I see it as the total evil of the unresolved problem of the insecurity of nations all became focused in on the Holocaust. But its true meaning was lost at that time, because it couldn't be, nobody understood it, and it couldn't be, the conclusion couldn't be drawn from it. And the Jews who were most in the position to draw it, their very lives were in, if they didn't have Israel, they would have nothing. So therefore they began to think, as Fackenheim did, this will now mean that we'll have our own fate in our own hand. But if the United States hadn't supported Israel, if both superpowers, if the superpowers all ganged up against Israel, could Israel survive? So you're dependent on a superpower, just so it isn't, as long as you can get one superpower, you're going to be okay. But now you're going to get all the superpowers. We're going to say what we need is a Hong Kong in this area, and I guarantee you some very magical things can happen. So anyway, it's because Fackenheim and I would say, are metaphysically so far apart that it is only the flexibility and the expansiveness of the unity principle that we find ourselves being members of the same people, but thank God for that. But well, anyway.
I think, that is a point that I really hadn't occurred to me quite that way before, but if I understood what you just said rightly, the Holocaust happened in the context of total war, which was a 20th century phenomenon. Exactly. And just never put the two things together.
But it also began at Verdun. Mm-hmm. That was a meaningless slaughter.
Right.
And by the way, it was like anti-Semitism. The slaughter occurred because Frenchmen believed what was not true about Germans, and Germans believed what was not true. Germans were not Huns. They were very civilized. So don't you see the same devices of anti-Semitism are universal devices? When you have the Jews, fine. But if you don't have the Jews, you slaughter each other. Was it Nagasaki or Hiroshima ever? There was a time, look, when I was growing up, the civilian populations had a certain kind of special treatment. But look what happened at Hamburg, the bombing of Hamburg. I mean, okay, so you justify it as the only way. But you're going to tell me that that is that the others get off scot-free. That's what I'm trying to say. Right. Jews are insecure because when the world is insecure. And the world is always insecure in one way or another. And therefore, overall, the Jews have had about as much or as little security as any of the others. But because they, in a sense, had so little of the other, they didn't waste any of their resources on having great generals, a whole array of non-human, energy-focused and non-human, anti-human pursuits. It simply wasn't allowed us, and therefore we focused on knowledge, on learning. Then we transferred that knowledge and learning of the Torah, the Talmud, and so on, to going to college and university when we came over to this country. The result was, so many things were just cut out for us. No Jew went to West Point, no Jews went into this sort of thing. So the result is now you got this pool of mental capital that is the most valuable capital in the world. There's no country in the world that wouldn't want to draw on that mental capital.
Okay, some other questions? All right, this gentleman down front, and then this gentleman here.
First, an observation. I'm sure you remember that C.P. Snow wrote in The Physicist that almost every, if not practically every modern theoretical physicist has been a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
It's a miracle.
Including a nephew of mine who teaches in
No, but then.
outstanding. He may even be in the audience. I also have a banker, too, a vice president. A nephew of mine is a vice president of one of the big Austrian bank, no less, a global bank, Jewish.
It's the shaping of Jewish history published by whom?
It was published by Scribner's, but it's temporarily out of print.
You can get it in our Buttonwieser library here.
Now my question.
Okay.
Your explanation of this whole concept of unity I found overwhelmingly stirring. And I remember my reading Spinoza having the concept for the first time. I've been puzzled. Is there any way of even sensing why the Jews, through that period between Abraham and Moses, evolved this first brilliant concept of unity? They invented the first spiritual monotheistic God.
Okay, all right. The question was going back to what was said before about the people were receptive to Isaiah because there was a great history of monotheism there and a readiness to continue it, and he gave them an opportunity to. What was going on between Abraham and Moses, the gentleman asked, that Jews could, one, develop this idea, and two, cling to it so persistently?
Well, I think it wasn't they invented, they stumbled on it. That is, what happened was you take a look at the structure of patriarchy. One patriarch, okay. Now this one patriarch had one God to undergird his legitimacy. When that singular authority of the patriarch was challenged by Lot, remember he said, go off and have yourself another tribe. We can't brook any but a one. So a single God was much more sustaining of a patriarchal system with authority and a single father, let us say, than multiple gods, which could allow for taking refuge in other gods to challenge the authority of the patriarch. Now, it may have been that there were other semi-nomadic groups that likewise had a single god, but they didn't have the same subsequent history. So this was the only one that had that history of that coming with this one god from a semi-nomadic origin, moving into the land, attributing to this one God the conquest of the land, and settling down. The others didn't. They just remained semi-nomads and so on. So it may not be that we were the first to have this kind of belief so much as we're the only one that tested it in the crucible of change, of radical change. And this prophetic type of leadership committed to this one God wouldn't let go of this one God, partly because that's where their authority came from. So I think that's is a kind of explanation that doesn't require a miracle, but it does account for what happened. And I also want to make it clear that history is full of examples of new ideas breaking through for which there is no precedent. Take the rise of Greek philosophy. So, we somehow or other, we had a combination of the idea plus the opportunity. Others may have had the idea, but they never had the opportunity.
Okay. Gentlemen, yes, on the aisle.
You described the recurring pattern of secure nations and cultures not only accepting but welcoming and seeking out after the Jewish people. And then as those societies or nations become insecure, finding the Jews
The question had to deal with why is it that nations, when they're at the height of their apogee of well-being, welcome the Jews in, and then as their decline sets in, a rejection of Jews seems to set in, and from whence within the host society might that antipathy originate?
Well, as far as we can best make out, until the rise of capitalism, there was an outermost limit on the possibility of economic growth. And when that limit was reached, since these societies were not, the rulers in these societies, the ruling elites in these societies were not entrepreneurs, they weren't motivated by profits, they were very spendthrift. That is, they assumed, particularly in the imperial phase, that their wealth would continue to grow and grow and grow, and they acted on that accordingly. Then when a limit was reached, and one of the limits was the technology of agriculture, there was a point at which you just couldn't produce more. You could optimize production within these other systems only up to a point, until the rise of capitalism. So every empire, as far as we can determine, declined when it reached that point where the income began to recede, and there wasn't enough to go round as before, so then they began to tax the people more than they had taxed, required more tribute, but they couldn't produce anymore, so therefore you were only making it worse. And then the ruling elites began to fight among themselves as how to divide up the declining surplus. And it's at that time when a helpless people become a diversionary opportunity. One, since they may have garnered some wealth, so you're able to take that wealth away from them. Secondly, you can take the anger at the people who are beginning to have to, because they have to pay more taxes and so on, and say, well, it's not coming systemically, but it's coming because of the Jews who obviously they don't believe in our gods, and they are aliens and this sort of thing, which hadn't bothered them a bit. By the way, it's very interesting to see the way Farrakhan, for example, and this other politician in Chicago play on that. The problem of a permanent underclass is a systemic problem. It's not coming from Jews, it's not coming from Gentiles, it's simply coming because American wealth is not what it was, and you have to decide, are you going to use all those billions to get rid of this underclass, or are you going to say, well, we have a permanent underclass and we'll police them and they have their drugs, wherever the case may be, and but we don't want to pay what it will cost, because we have $3 trillion is our national debt now, I understand. All right, so Farrakhan comes along to the blacks, and he doesn't say, well, look, this is a systemic problem. What can we do to find a way in which we can solve the problem of unemployment in a constructive way? No, he says the Jews. In other words, if there weren't the Jews, you wouldn't have a systemic problem. Now, it's easy enough then. It's much easier to blame the Jews who are, seem to be wealthy. When's the last time you saw an unemployed Jew? When's the last time you saw a Jew that wasn't in a Rolls Royce or a Cadillac? Where's a condominium that isn't full of Jews, etc.? It's there for presumably all of them to see. Therefore, by splitting those who have garnered wealth into those who are exploited, after Hitler did, exploitative, as against those, so to speak, who just fell into their hands or something, you are able generally to arouse masses of people. So that's what happened. And but the point was that once you got rid of the Jews, it didn't stop the systemic collapse. So then they began destroying each other. Didn't you have the War of the Roses after there weren't any Jews there? Didn't you have the wars of the Front? And so look at all the civil wars that you had in the decaying years of feudalism in Spain, etc. So those are the dynamics. And now with the rise of capitalism, you have a economic system that has no limits as to what it can create in the way of wealth. But capitalism didn't function in the early years as a universal system, as it's now moving to become, but it's broken up into nation-state capitalists rivalrous with each other. So that's where these nation-state wars came from, not from capitalism as an economic system, but the fact that capitalism was fragmented into national capitalisms rather than what is happening now with development of global capitalism. And then you had anti-Semitism. When they were doing well, the Jews were brought in and treated well. Do poorly, you get anti-Semitism. The answer is simple enough. Getting it accomplished, another story. But watch that European community. Just watch it go. By the year 2000, you might get the Messianic era. Just you wait.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but I feel as though I've been listening to a little bit of Isaiah here tonight, and I hope that his good words come through.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.